All right, it's Daniel here from ColivingDAO, and today we'll be talking a little bit more about Bitcoin. We did record a video about Bitcoin not too long ago, and therefore, if you are completely new to Bitcoin, we definitely encourage you to check it out. It's actually about the future of money. So that's pretty much to give an idea of what Bitcoin, or let's say Bitcoin's role is in our society, and why it is part of the future of money. We go a lot more in depth there, so definitely check it out if you're new to the concept. But here, what we'll do, again, it's still going to be an introduction, it's slightly more technical compared to the other video. We'll be talking about the white paper by Satoshi Nakamoto, and then we'll talk about 21 lessons, very important book by Gigi, and you can find all this online, 21lessons.com, and you can easily find the white paper online as well. And the reason we're doing this is just so that you can understand Bitcoin better if you're new to it, and if you're really familiar with Bitcoin, what we're doing effectively is just giving you an idea of what the main takeaways are from the white paper and from 21 lessons. I do encourage you to go through those because they're definitely worth your time. But if you don't have a lot of time, or if you haven't decided yet whether you want to allocate the time, this video is going to be extremely useful, because if you find it interesting, then you can go more in depth. And if you think that this is enough, that's all you needed to know, that might be enough in some cases as well. I do encourage you to find out more though. But let's talk about a white paper. And again, without going too deep, one of the main concepts in the white paper is the concept of decentralization. So Bitcoin doesn't have essential authority. And this is very important because it relies on peer-to-peer transactions. The network is completely peer-to-peer. Transactions happen on a peer-to-peer basis. The security of the network is maintained on a peer-to-peer basis, and therefore everything like validation and pretty much everything that happens on the blockchain is done in a decentralized way. So the lack of central authority really eliminates a major central point of failure, which is extremely important. It's a proof of work network. More specifically, the consensus mechanism is called proof of work. It requires energy, it requires a computational effort, and this is what effectively ensures the integrity of the blockchain, because by making this effort, it's possible to pretty much prevent fraud, avoid double spending. We'll be explaining what it is by converting energy and computational work into outputs. The output can be validation of the transactions that are genuine, and therefore not validating the transactions that should not be validated. Basically preventing people from spending the same money twice. That is a very important concept, which is point three here, avoiding the problem of double spending. This was actually the main reason why people before have tried to create something similar to Bitcoin and failed, because they couldn't find an actual solution for double spending. If you think about that, digital scarcity was something that pretty much didn't exist before. In fact, if you think of music, what was the main thing with music? When you started downloading music online, you didn't have that scarcity anymore than you had when you were using CDs or different ways to listen to music, vinyls, whatever it is. So creating the digital scarcity, making sure that if I send you an MP3, I can send the MP3 to someone else as well, right? But if I send you a Bitcoin, I can send that Bitcoin to anyone else. And this is actually a new concept. Before Bitcoin, we didn't have anything like that. So the solution to double spending is done through cryptography. And therefore, once a transaction is confirmed on the blockchain, it cannot be spent again. That's very important. And it cannot be altered as well. It can't be reversed or anything. So digital scarcity also occurs in the fact that Bitcoin supply is capped at 21 million. Now, not all Bitcoin has been distributed yet, has been issued yet. We say mined, so some Bitcoin is yet to be mined. But once all Bitcoin is mined, which is going to happen in the year 2140, there will be no more than 21 million Bitcoin. And some of it has been lost forever. So the real limitation is actually even lower than that. The real supply cap is lower than that. So Bitcoin is even more limited in supply than that in practice. But from a mathematical standpoint, 21 million is the absolute maximum. And this creates scarcity, and it effectively mimics gold when it comes to creating that sense of scarcity. And it's probably even better because gold is more inflationary. The gold supply inflates at a rate of about 2% a year, and it's always possible to find more gold somewhere else. What if an asteroid comes to Earth and there's gold in it? All of a sudden, the value of gold per unit might go down because the supply has been increased. And that's an unpredictable increase. With Bitcoin, that is not going to happen. Security through cryptography. This is an important point as well. So again, we're using cryptography. That's why we speak about crypto. And that's why initially we were using this term cryptocurrency. We're slightly moving away from this term because we're not really focusing on the currency aspect. Bitcoin is a lot more than a currency. It's an asset. So I personally prefer to use the term crypto asset. We can consider Bitcoin a commodity. We can consider Bitcoin digital property. More in general, again, we consider Bitcoin an asset, just like gold. Gold is not necessarily a currency, but we can say it's money, just like gold is money. And the currency is one element of money. Money is a lot more than a currency. And we don't need to talk about that. If you want to know more about the future of money, again, we have a video on that. But what's important is that through cryptography, it's possible to ensure privacy for users. When we talk about privacy, we're not talking about hiding everything. In fact, the blockchain is quite transparent, and it's possible to see transactions. So what we're really talking about is pseudonymity. So what we see is addresses, and we don't know who the actual individual is behind a certain address or entity, but we can still see the transactions. So there is transparency while keeping a level of privacy through pseudonymity of users. Timestamping is an interesting concept as well, and you will see Bitcoin fans sometimes using Bitcoin blocks or more specifically block numbers as a way to even track time. And every transaction has a timestamp. So what really matters here is that we know what transaction happened before another transaction. Because if we somehow miss some information on the order of transactions, it becomes confusing. We don't know what transactions are real and what aren't. So timestamping is very important because we need to know that to achieve consensus without relying on a centralized party. And there's also a system of incentives in Bitcoin. So miners are rewarded by effectively providing computational energy and validating transactions, and they are rewarded by receiving more Bitcoin. And there are mining rewards that are part of the protocol, and there are also transaction fees as well. So the Bitcoin that is not yet in circulation is distributed through mining to the miners. They successfully solve the computational problems, and also they receive a share of the transaction fees. In fact, once all Bitcoin is mined, transaction fees will be the only reward for miners. So that's pretty important as well. And again, this might sound a little technical for people that are new to this, but for the ones that know a bit more about Bitcoin, it's probably a good recap to understand why Bitcoin is so innovative. And if you want to know more about uh, the reason this is so important, again, go and check out the resources that we have available. And let's talk a bit about 21 lessons. I again reiterate that this is by Gigi, and you can go to 21lessons.com. It's a very interesting work. It's divided into three chapters, and the first of the three chapters is called philosophy. Um, and part one is immutability and change. So a key characteristic of Bitcoin, this is lesson one, a key characteristic of Bitcoin is that no centralized entity can change its rules. So no one can effectively change Bitcoin in a centralized way. If everyone, or let's say 51% of the um how to say it in a simple way, if 51% of the entities that are validating the network decide to change something, then it's possible. But to coordinate 51% of the validators, and more importantly, to incentivize them to change the network, that's something that is probably not very feasible in practice. That's why Bitcoin is so secure. So regardless of that, there is no one entity that can change Bitcoin, but Bitcoin is changing us in multiple ways, and it's probably changing the world forever. So that's a very exciting moment in many ways. Um, Talking about scarcity, I like the way he puts this, the scarcity of scarcity. Not many things are really scarce. In fact, we could argue probably nothing is truly scarce because most assets inflate at a certain rate. So Bitcoin is really the only asset that has absolutely zero inflation once the 21 million cap is reached. You can argue that in art, for example, if you take paintings by a dead artist, there's no more possible paintings by the same artist, and I agree with that. But obviously, there can be more paintings by other artists, and sometimes you never know. Maybe you discover a new painting that you were not aware of. Sometimes they discover that a certain artist had created more artworks in the past. So a lot of things can happen, and there's no the same level of transparency there. And again, it's hard to think of another asset that is so scarce. So Bitcoin is probably the hardest asset that we have right now. Gold inflates, currency inflates a lot. Um, Property, real estate inflates. So all these things, again, they don't have a cap supply. Bitcoin does. Replication and locality is very interesting. In order for all this to happen, Bitcoin needs to be replicated globally on a distributed ledger. So everyone needs to have all the information about all the transactions. So no one locally um, is like the sole holder of certain information. So everyone needs to be um, having that information so that transactions can be validated. But locally, holders own their own keys, and there's something called a private key that effectively is an entry on the ledger. So in order to be able to access the ledger, private keys are um, called private for a reason. The reason is the holder can therefore make transactions that no one else can make because that's how they effectively quote unquote own the Bitcoin. In reality, again, Bitcoin is not something tangible, it's simply an entry on a ledger. So what people hold when they hold the private key is effectively access to make transactions on that ledger. Now, with identity, when the system is decentralized, there's no such thing as fixed identity. So how do you know what is authentic? And again, it's through consensus. That's why it's so important to have a decentralized system of multiple actors that are validating transactions and understanding what's real and what's not. At Immaculate Conception, this is one of my favorite points. Satoshi Nakamoto, who we already mentioned, by the way, because the white paper was written by Satoshi. No one knows who he is, and okay, maybe some people know, but it doesn't really matter because it just disappeared, and that's it. It's gone. So Bitcoin was conceived in an immaculate way, and this makes it so special because how likely is it that we're going to get another immaculate conception on another asset? Gold doesn't have a single issuer. Silver doesn't have a single issuer. The fact that there isn't one identifiable issuer makes the asset a lot more decentralized. So it feels like receiving a gift from the gods. So it's kind of cool. Now, Bitcoin also emphasizes the power of free speech because effectively it's text-based. Everything that we're exchanging on the blockchain is text. So can you really stop text? This is a philosophical question. That's why we're talking about philosophy here. So Bitcoin is unstoppable as long as you consider free speech unstoppable or protected. And that's why Bitcoin is so important. Bitcoin is freedom. And Bitcoin is also really changing our perception of the limits of knowledge because the technology is so deep, but then the concept is so simple. So it's really challenging the limits of knowledge without really being something abstract. And I know maybe here, if you're kind of new to Bitcoin, you may be feeling, wait, Daniel, what are you even talking about? Everything will make sense. Again, I encourage you to check out our previous resources on Bitcoin and ask questions. If something is not clear, I know I'm going a little fast, and this is going to make sense to people that are a bit more familiar already with some of these concepts, and therefore it's just taking an extra step. But if something is not clear, by all means, leave a question in the comments. We'll be happy to answer that and give a bit more clarity. Then we go on to the economics lessons. Lesson 8 is financial ignorance. So a big lesson about finance can be learned with Bitcoin. And personally, I'm shocked to learn how little people know about finance. And that was really exposed by Bitcoin. The more I study Bitcoin and the more I hear mainstream people talk about Bitcoin, the more I realize how little they understand about finance. And everyone in our society is using money and currency, and most of them have no idea what they're doing. So, again, I'm not saying this to take people down. It's just that I'm shocked that we don't have nearly as much financial education as is needed to really make people just literate. Just like we teach the language and we teach some basic math in school and a bunch of other things, I don't understand why we don't teach financial education. Well, there's probably some pseudo conspiracy theories around that, so some maybe more conspiracy than others. But the whole point is a lot of people don't understand how money works. A lot of people don't understand debt, and this means that they unfortunately do not manage their finances in the best possible way. Bitcoin makes things a lot simpler, but more importantly, it's a great source of information. So if you don't know much about finance, make sure you study more about Bitcoin. You will learn a lot. And by all means, go back to our Future of Money YouTube video because that's where you're going to understand more about the financial system and how it works. Inflation. Bitcoin teaches how by issuing new currency, existing currency goes down in value. So value of the currency that you have is continually eroded and continually going down. So the ones that have the ability to print more currency are going to benefit because they just print it from thin air pretty much. And the ones that do not have the ability to print more currency are going to become poorer and poorer. And that's a problem. So it's a problem you need to be aware of. What's value? Value is subjective, but value is not arbitrary. So when something is scarce, when something requires labor, when something is irreplaceable, when something is useful, all of a sudden this thing is valuable. And Bitcoin has all these qualities. That's why Bitcoin is valuable. Now, how valuable can be subjective. The market is still kind of deciding how valuable it is. When you see a lot of volatility, what it means. A lot of people get scared of volatility and say, "Oh, it's volatile, it's dangerous," and that's people that have no idea what they're doing. But what volatility is a sign that people are trying to agree on what a fair price for this new thing is. That's what volatility is. So people are trying to price it, and we all agree that Bitcoin is very valuable. All the people that are trading Bitcoin all the people that understand Bitcoin agree that it's valuable. How valuable is something that we're looking to find an agreement on. So value is subjective but not arbitrary, and Bitcoin really embodies all the qualities that make something valuable. Anything, not just Bitcoin. Um, those qualities make anything valuable. So anything that is scarce and so on and so forth. Now, money is a medium of exchange and is evolving from physical objects to digital assets. So in the past, people were using shells, people were using precious metals and a bunch of other things, even salt. Um, and now people understand that they can use Bitcoin because Bitcoin is something that is hard, scarce, and resistant to inflation. Those physical assets had a certain level of resistance to inflation, a certain level of scarcity and hardness. Bitcoin is harder, more scarce, more resistant to inflation. That's why it's a better form of money. And money evolved from, especially if we talk about currency in this case. So imagine US dollar, British pound, the euro, and so on. They used to be commodity backed. They are no longer commodity backed. So a lot of money was initially printed on the gold standard, meaning a dollar bill was redeemable for the equivalent in gold. And therefore, there was a vault or a bank that was effectively holding gold per each dollar bill that was outstanding. This is no longer the case. Nowadays, money is fiat, so currency, US dollar, and pretty much every currency in the world is fiat currency, meaning there's nothing backing that other than just the government declaring it legal tender. But they're no longer backed by a commodity. So the value is just decided and imposed by governments, and therefore it's very centralized. What Bitcoin does, it offers a decentralized alternative to that. Also, our system is based on something called fractional reserve, meaning if you go to a bank and you deposit, let's say $100, the bank is allowed to lend, let's say 90% of it, let's say $90 to someone else, and they only keep 10%, so they only keep $10 because they know you're not going to take that $100 back necessarily the day after. And if you are, not everyone is. So let's say that the bank knows that out of 100 people that put down $100, less than 90 people excuse me, less than 10 people want that money back shortly after. So the bank says, okay, I don't need to keep all this money in my vault because there's no point. These people are not all coming back tomorrow and claiming their money back. So I only need to keep some of it. And the problem is, okay, now they lend 90% of it. So now there's this extra $90 created out of thin air, and the person who borrows $90, they can actually go to another bank, deposit this $90 that are already made of thin air, and then that bank in turn will lend 90% of it out and so on. So you have multiple cycles of thin air that is basically being recycled through a number on a screen, which we call money or currency, but in reality, it's just literally an entry on a centralized ledger. So it's kind of funny when people say Bitcoin is intangible. I mean, currency is equally intangible. The only difference, well, there's a bunch of differences, but the main difference is that Bitcoin is decentralized, so cannot be changed, and especially cannot be inflated. Excuse me, cannot be inflated. What this means is supply is fixed, so you can't have this fractional reserve continuous loop where banks create more and more of it out of thin air. You don't have that with Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is sound money because of its fixed supply. And yes, there is issuance, as we mentioned, but it's predictable and controlled. So that is what makes Bitcoin something useful as a store of value because it doesn't inflate as much as other assets. Now, the strength in numbers, and here we're talking a bit more about technology. So this is chapter 3 or 21 lessons. The strengths in numbers. Bitcoin security comes from numbers. So with cryptography, there's this massive um, sequences of characters or words. You may have heard of seed phrases and stuff like that. Without getting technical, I know this section, there's the risk of getting a bit too technical. I'm looking to avoid that. Basically, we are talking about a level of encryption that makes brute force attacks nearly impossible. Some people are worried about quantum computers. We're nowhere near the computing power needed to brute force Bitcoin. So we're very safe for the time being. And and by the way, this is much safer than a lot of other systems, like the banking systems, for example, or your passwords and other things. So this is definitely not a Bitcoin weakness. Bitcoin is extremely secure in that sense. So decentralized permissionless participation is possible thanks to the fact that numbers are really strengthening the system. And the interesting thing is also that Bitcoin removes the need for trust because actually makes things verifiable. So cryptography allows people to be able to transact and interact with others without needing to trust them. So rather than needing a third-party verification, cryptography makes that possible on a decentralized way. Also, telling time takes work. This is an important thing. We spoke a little bit about timekeeping when we were talking about the white paper. So Bitcoin mining ensures decentralized timekeeping through proof of work. So again, the validation is completely independent, and the consensus uh, is reached on the transaction order, just like we said before. It's very important to understand which transaction came first and which came later. And this again happens through this decentralized system, so extremely secure. Also, the idea of moving slowly and not breaking things. So, move slowly and don't break things. This is obviously in contrast with the move fast and break things, which is pretty much a mantra in the startup ecosystem. Bitcoin is different. Bitcoin is software, but Bitcoin shows that software doesn't have to move fast and break things. Software can move slowly and not break things by simply relying on a very strong level of consensus. If a large group of people agrees to change something in Bitcoin, it can happen, but it doesn't happen overnight. And this means Bitcoin is much, much safer than other pieces of software that can be changed overnight. So Bitcoin is a lot more stable, secure, and resilient thanks to that. Privacy is not that. That's interesting because for some people, privacy is dead, but then we realize, okay, it's still possible to keep a certain level of privacy. And again, some people, when they hear privacy, they think about scams and dodgy things, and it doesn't have to be the case. Privacy is a human right, but we're not talking about hiding identities in order to commit crimes, not at all. We're simply talking about making sure that people have the right to privacy, and that's why the transactions are pseudonymous. So they're not completely anonymous, they're pseudonymous, meaning we kind of remove that prejudice that we have. When we see things happen and associate things to a certain identity, it becomes hard to focus on merit, to focus on really the objective contribution that someone is providing, because there's an identity associated to that, and that is really triggering a lot of human cognitive biases. So by removing that, we can really focus on merit and contributions for what they are. And that's all thanks to encryption. So this is a really key element of Bitcoin. Cypherpunks write code. Bitcoin was built on the cypherpunk movement. Satoshi turned a bunch of ideas into an actual reality through writing code. So that is a very important technological lesson as well. And a couple of metaphors for Bitcoin's future. Internet, electricity, transformational big revolutions. When the internet was born, it didn't happen overnight. There was a lot of work. There was a lot of uncertainty in the beginning as well. But some people really understood that it was going to be the future, and now history told us that they were right. And this is what's happening with Bitcoin as well. If you look at the adoption curve, if we look at how a technology is spreading and it's gradually being more and more adopted, Bitcoin is following that technological curve, let's say. So it's exponential, but there's a lot of ups and downs. And if you're in if you're in Bitcoin right now, or if you're considering being in Bitcoin, then you're more than welcome to join us in this ride. We are really enjoying being in Bitcoin because it's transformational, it's revolutionary, and it's changing the world. And again, if you want to understand more about how Bitcoin is changing the world, make sure you check out our video on the future of money. And if you have any questions at all on what we discussed today, you definitely want to ask that in the comments. We are going to reply. We are going to answer your questions. So make sure you leave a comment. Maybe you have no questions, but you just want to say hi. Feel free to leave a comment and we will chat there.